Hello, everyone, and welcome to my session today. I'd like to touch on some of the threat landscape that the Qualys team is seeing over the course of the 2022 calendar year. We spent a lot of time looking at what that threat landscape looked at throughout the year. We packaged up a lot of insights that we're seeing from our platform and made that available in a report that's available today to anybody to take a look at. So today I want to kind of touch into some of those insights that we're seeing so we can understand what the threat landscape looked like in 2022 and try to predict where the threat landscape is going and what those trends are shifting into 2023 and beyond. So what we did for this was look at the 163 most dangerous vulnerabilities that were published in 2022. And there's a few different categories or ways that we identify that a vulnerability is dangerous, that we tried to add it to this list, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So we looked at a lot of the anonymous detection statistics from our platform, from products like our vulnerability management, VMDR, our web application security product, policy compliance, as well as our cloud products to look at some of the statistics that we have from that, augmented that with some of the detection statistics that we have from the malware side of the house, and kind of tied a lot of that into intelligence that we have on these types of configurations, these types of vulnerabilities, this malware, and augmented that with the expert analysis from the Qualys Threat Research Unit to provide those insights and package all of those up for everybody to take a look at. So what we came across was that there were really 5 categories that we were identifying throughout this report. The first one being that speed is the key to outmaneuvering adversaries. We're looking at specifically how quickly organizations are patching vulnerabilities versus how quickly threat actors are leveraging those vulnerabilities. And we kind of will dig into the details on that. Looking at some of the details of those vulnerabilities of how they're patched, right? We see that automation is the difference of the key between success and failure for organizations, where these vulnerabilities, which can be automated and are automated, are patched obviously much faster, more often in organizations. We can see that that's making a difference. But more specifically, tying that into vulnerabilities that are leveraged by one of the more dangerous threat actor groups out there, known as initial access brokers or affiliates, we can see that these threat actor groups are targeting the vulnerabilities which are patched a little bit slower. And I'll share some of those vulnerabilities and why they're targeting them. But one of the things that they're specifically trying to get into as part of their initial access is targeting something like web applications or your perimeter devices. So we're looking at what are the detections we see from web application, and what are the insights we have from that. And misconfigurations is the biggest category of issues that we're finding across these types of things. And in fact, a third of web applications that we scanned had some type of misconfiguration associated with it. And I'll touch on the dangers of that throughout this session today. And then finally, if we know that misconfigurations are an issue from the web application side, I wanted to understand what does the rest of the infrastructure look like, right? The cloud, the on-premises devices, and what are the issues that we have from there. And what we're finding is that of these controls that are failing, more often than not, they are associated and leading and opening the door to ransomware. We'll touch on how we came to that conclusion throughout this session today. But before I do that, I'll take a step back and take a look at the 50,000-foot view of the vulnerability threat landscape. From 1988, when vulnerabilities first started being published and tracked, and through the end of last year, there was 192,000 of these vulnerabilities that were published. Right, it's a mountain of vulnerabilities to try to manage for any organization trying to protect their infrastructure against exploitation and threat actors. But if we look at which ones are the most risky to an organization, it's a smaller subset of that. In fact, less than 3% of these vulnerabilities introduce risk in some way, at least the most risk to an organization. So something that has weaponized code available on something like ExploitDB, GitHub, built-in Metasploit, those types of things where a threat actor, a red teamer, easily can go down that exploit code and run it against one of their victims or targets that they're trying to track. So these are the various categories that we identify that something is risky, right? Some of those other ones would be, is it included in a malware toolkit, or more specifically, some of the ransomware stuff? Is it attributed to a named threat actor, one of these more notorious threat actor groups that are tracked from various industry experts? And then finally, the things that are added to the CISA known exploited vulnerability catalog. These are the ones that CISA has curated, and we have actual evidence, or they have actual evidence of this vulnerability being exploited, and letting organizations know that they should go through and patch it because it is introducing risk to your organization. If we shrink that down into what happened in 2022, we see 25,000 vulnerabilities were released, which that's a considerable amount of the overall threat landscape. So there is exponential growth in the vulnerabilities that are being published, and there's various reasons for that. But still, if we look at just the ones that were introducing risk, as I mentioned before, less than 1% of the vulnerabilities that were announced last year were weaponized within that year, right? And that's kind of a false sense of security because these are just the ones that were announced last year that were weaponized. There were still, 400 or 500 other vulnerabilities which were published in years prior to 2022, which had a exploit or evidence of exploitation happening for the first time in 2022. And some of these vulnerabilities are really old, right? Released in the early 2000s. So there are vulnerabilities that are outside of the ones that we're paying attention to from blogs and being published year over year. That these older ones that threat actors are still targeting, and in fact targeting for the first time. So it's important to have this kind of threat-informed defense so we can take this type of context to apply it to the prioritization for a vulnerability patching type program. But getting into what really this threat landscape looked to, we looked at the riskiest vulnerabilities that are in here. Right, I mentioned there was 163 specifically that were published last year. Right, and all these numbers obviously add up to more than that. And it's really a Venn diagram of where all of these things happen. And right, the vulnerabilities which are the most risky to organizations are the ones that fall into all of these categories. Right, have a public weaponized code available. We've seen it added to the CISA list. It's known to be attributed to a threat actor, and it's built into malware toolkits. Right, so basically every threat actor in the world is leveraging this vulnerability in some way. Right, and those are the ones that obviously bubble up to the top for what that we want to take a look at. So what we did is we took a lot of these detection statistics and looked at how quickly we are seeing organizations detecting them and remediating them, and what that speed is and what the patch rate looks like. But also looked at, from the flip side, how quickly threat actors are leveraging these and how quickly they're being an exploit is being made available. And there's that obvious delta that we saw there, and we can see that speed is the key to outmaneuvering adversaries. So if we look at the data that goes behind that, the defenders are patching in 30.6 days, so 31 days, roughly within a month. That's how quickly the organizations that are detecting it are applying a remediation and eliminating that vulnerability from their environment. On the flip side, threat actors are leveraging these, or an exploit is available within 19 and a half days. So, on average, we can see that vulnerabilities have an exploitation opportunity for 11.1 days within organizations, right? And that's just for the vulnerabilities which have been remediated. And so these risky vulnerabilities are still, by the end of the year, only patched at 57.7%. So there's still 43% of vulnerabilities that are introducing the most risk, which still haven't been patched yet, which would have well over 300 days of exploitation opportunity for those vulnerabilities, right? That would have been released earlier in the year versus later in the year. Right? We can kind of slice and dice it in various different ways in some of those different categories, but most often across the board, we can see that this is happening where vulnerabilities are being weaponized much quicker than threat actors are able to leverage them. So if we look at just the overall average or typical vulnerability lifecycle, we can see that day zero, that's when the vulnerability is disclosed and published to the world. Right, that's when that gets published to the NVD. On day 19, that's, as I mentioned before, when that average weaponization time happens. If we look at kind of where that line in the sand is drawn of when we kind of have evidence of this, we can see that the vulnerabilities that are added to the CISA known exploited vulnerability catalog are, in 2022, are on average 27 days old when they got added to that catalog. CISA mandates that you should patch within 3 weeks, right? So that takes you to the day 48 of how old a vulnerability should be before it should be patched or remediated out of your environment. All right, so the good news is that organizations, right, are patching on 30 days, right? So they're from a compliance standpoint, everything's good, and we're patching before that CISA mandated patch date. The bad news being that between that delta between day 19 and 30, that there's that 11 days opportunity to exploit for these threat actors. So knowing that this is the average, right, obviously when you take a look at average and we're looking at a large data set, there's various vulnerabilities which can skew the numbers one way or the other. So we looked at some of the various catalogs that we had there, and one of the ones that really was highlighted was threat actors, right? The vulnerabilities which have been attributed to a named threat actor are patched much faster, right? 20.7 days versus the average of 30. I wanted to understand really why, and it's not because a vulnerability is attributed to a named threat actor, right? Because we can see that the typical time to associate a vulnerability to a threat actor happens, within 3 months on day 95. That's typically when that attribution happens, because that process of actually attributing some type of evidence that we have to a specific group takes quite a bit of time, or it's a very lengthy process that happens. So it's not because it's a threat actor that's driving these numbers down. It has to be something else. So looking at the overall data set of these vulnerabilities, we can see that from a scatter chart, what we're looking at here is each point is a vulnerability, right? And across the axis here, we can see right, days of 350 is where we go to 365 days in a year, and then how much that patch rate is, how often it's been patched. And looking at this, there's really nothing to discern from this information, right? There's some vulnerabilities which are patched really quickly, really fast, and then some, on the lower right, which are really old and still patched, 10, 15% of the time. So, what was, the difference that we saw there? So we wanted to look at what were the things that were detected the most often, right? So of these vulnerabilities that were weaponized, which ones were detected most often? And everything in the top 10 list we can see here is Google Chrome or Microsoft Windows. And that, that obviously makes sense. See, number one in browser market share, operating system market share. So those are the types of things that are going to be yeah, detected the most often. And if we look at the detection rates here, right, they're very quick, right? Everything in 20 days or less, right? And we look at some of the RTIs or the indicators that we have of weaponized or associated with threat actors, so on and so forth. Right, it's across the board here, where Windows and Chrome is patched much faster, right? And if we know anything about how Windows and Chrome is patched, right, those are very, they can be automated and they are automated quite often by many organizations, right? If we look at the trend line for these vulnerabilities, we can see that, we can kind of call it a hockey stick, where within, the first 30, 60 days, the vulnerabilities are remediated within 90% of the time and then kind of level out from there, right? So we can actually see a trend line when we shift into these vulnerabilities that are Windows and Chrome versus the larger data set. Right. So if we know that the automation is, very mature for these types of these products, we can see that automation can be or is the difference between success and failure. So obviously, Windows and Chrome aren't the only vulnerability, or sorry, the only products technologies that can be automated. There's a few more as well, but we can look at specifically if we first look at what is the mean time to remediation or patch rate for these, we can see that Windows and Chrome is patched twice as fast and twice as often as everything else within the organization. And that doesn't matter which way you skew that lens, whether you're looking at one of these various categories. Across the board, no matter how you look at it, Windows and Chrome is patched twice as fast and twice as often. If you look at the larger data set of things that can be automated, right? So looking at some of the other applications or Linux and Mac and the other technologies which can have a patch deployed automatically, right? It's not twice as fast, twice as often, but there is a definite improvement for how quickly these patches are being deployed, how often they're being deployed. We see the improvement rates with this chart here. So knowing that, the group of initial access brokers is a group of threat actors that our threat research unit is tracking constantly, right? Also, they also are known as affiliates by some other organizations. But what we're seeing is that they're attacking really what organizations are ignoring. So how they work just kind of set up the stage for what they do. Initial access brokers, they'll get into an organization in one of a few different ways, right? They're trying to establish that obviously initial access, right? They'll come in either phishing is obviously a very popular entry point for them because it gives them access to every user within your organization that has an email. But they'll also try to get in through perimeter devices, right? Try to exploit those or abuse misconfigurations. Or one of their favorite ones is just using valid credentials, whether they stole them, bought them off the dark web, or just simply guessed them or brute forced them. Right? Using valid credentials typically gets you in a little bit stealthier than trying to run exploits across devices that are being monitored. But they'll get in, figure out where the crown jewels are, figure out what the value of that data is, and they'll either sell that access off to a different group or they'll just leverage it themselves. And typically, who they're selling to or how they leverage it, their end game is almost always ransomware. So this is how they work, right? And one of the obviously the top path that we're highlighting here is the perimeter devices, things like web applications, your Exchange, routers, firewalls, those types of devices that you have connected and are externally available. But the group of vulnerabilities which threat actors are these threat actors are leveraging. We see the top 17 here that we're taking a look at. Every single one in this group, if you notice, is not Windows, it's not Chrome, it's things outside of that department. So we have obviously a lot of externally facing applications here, technologies that are associated with things like PHP. or externally facing devices like routers or Exchange, as I mentioned. If you look at the patch rate for these, it's 45 and a half days, which is 28 days slower than how fast organizations are patching something like Windows and Chrome. Or if you look at the larger data set of all weaponized and risky vulnerabilities of 30 days, it's still 50% higher than that of still another 15 days. But threat actors are targeting these vulnerabilities, right? One could say because they're running into these more often because organizations are getting better at patching, right? The optimist in me says that organizations are doing the right things and they're automating these things and making threat actors change their tactics. But we do have evidence that things are making a difference and they're targeting things outside of your Windows and Chrome, which is good. So we can continue that automation and focus efforts on remediating some of these other ones that are in the environment. But again, also from the patch rate, patched a little bit less as well. So definitely making a difference. So one of the things that they're looking at to target from a threat actor group is your externally facing systems, your web applications, and things like that. So we wanted to pull what the web application security stance looked like in 2022 for a lot of our different detections that we had. And as I mentioned in the beginning, a third of the detections that we had for web applications had some type of misconfiguration. And if we map all of these detections to the OWASP top 10, the bulk of those are in misconfiguration, right? And it's so large that even some of these other categories don't look like they have any detections because it was such a big problem, right? We'd separate it between internal ones or external, but typically most of these are externally facing. So what are the issues that a misconfiguration can lead to, right? It can lead to a few different things, but some of the threat detections that we're seeing on from our side of the specific evidence, looking at things like linking to other malicious things, dropping malicious files on there, but more often than not, what they're looking at is either abusing a web application to delve further into that victim organization, or they're going to use it, dropping malware on there not to target that organization, but then use that as a staging to attack somebody else. So this would be worst case scenario, but typically more often than not, what they're looking at from misconfigurations and the information they get out of it is information disclosure, things like what is the backend technologies, what is the databases, web applications, things like that. So then they can try to tailor their attacks to further get into there to finally get one of what we're seeing here of some of these actual threat detections. But overall, like I said, configurations are an issue from web applications, one of the biggest issues that we have there. But what does the misconfiguration situation look like in the rest of the infrastructure, in the cloud, in on-premise devices? And what we're seeing is that, as I mentioned, it's opening the door to ransomware. So let me talk into how we got to there. So we looked at first the cloud detections that we have for AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure, right? Some of the three biggest cloud providers that are out there. And mapped what the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, benchmarks are for those. So the way those benchmarks are broken down is in each individual benchmark, you have different sections, chapters, right, so to speak. All right, so some of them have more, some have less, but there's 30 overall that of these various categories across all of these three providers. 13 of those are failing more than 50% of the time. So that red box that we're seeing in here, everything that has a line below that red box is failing more often than not. And there's some concerning things in here, right? If you look at AWS, let me dig into that one a little bit more. We see S3 here in the middle is failing more than 50% of the time. So those configurations, those controls, which are hardening S3, are failing more often than not, right? And anybody that's looked at news articles or publications around breaches that are happening in the cloud, specifically in AWS, right? Often you'll see an open S3 bucket, something like that, right? And configurations can be a major part of that, right? And there's been definite improvements in the default configuration over the years that we've seen, where a default S3 bucket is not open to the externally facing by default. But there are other compensating controls that can lead an attacker to enable those types of things. So we looked at that. We looked at also the on-premises things, specifically endpoints, your Windows, Linux types of things, and found the controls that are failing more often than not are in one of these three buckets. So the top failing controls would either be dealing with password hygiene, user permissions, or update settings. I'm not too concerned with the update settings, right? Because you can disable the local Windows update settings and leverage something like some other type of patch management solution. The more concerning ones are password hygiene and user permissions, right? Because that can obviously, a lot of threat actors are after your valid credentials, specifically domain admins, but just any valid credential they can find is useful to them. And then, once they get that, they're going to try to escalate their privileges to get that valuable admin, local admin, domain admin type credentials, which, we can see some of these controls are failing more often than not. So what we did is we looked at all of these ones that are failing more than 50% of the time and tried to understand what was that leading to. And we leveraged some work that was done by the MITRE Center for Threat Informed Defense, in which they were mapping the misconfigurations to the MITRE attack framework. So we looked at from the cloud side, what were the top controls that are failing, and we can see the top three are exploitation of remote services, data destruction, and data from a cloud storage object. Or more simply put, would be exploitation, encryption, and exfiltration. From the on-premises side, we can see that the top three bubbled up to brute force, RDP, and then abuse elevation control mechanism. And really what this is tying into is that attackers are trying to find a exposed RDP, either brute force or exploit into it. Once they get that access, try to elevate their privileges so they can move east-west within the organization. Right, and that really describes the way the threat actor group, something like an initial access broker or just any threat actor that's trying to break into an organization, how they try to get in and move about the environment. But overall, if you tie these, these to that, we can see that these are obviously relating to ransomware, specifically from the cloud side when we see exploitation, encryption, and exfiltration, because that's exactly how every ransomware is happening, especially the migration of what we've seen from ransomware, not just encrypting data, but also exfiltrating it and trying to extort their victims. So even if you have all of your vulnerabilities patched in your environment, misconfigurations still can introduce some type of risk to your organization. So at Qualys, we have a actual ransomware specific policy outside of just your things like CIS or DISA-STIGs, which is looking at all the configurations that are specifically able to help mitigate or prevent ransomware from becoming a problem in your organization. Overall, the pass rate is just a hair over 50%, which is not incredibly great. But the good news being that if you look at like a default installation of Windows, that pass rate is only 34%. So organizations are actually making a difference in improving the overall security of their organizations from the misconfiguration standpoint. We can look at some of those individuals' controls. But all of this, to kind of summarize, is packaged up. All the details is available in, as I mentioned, our Qualys True Risk Research Report. It's a well-written document that we have available. Anybody can go download it today. I can give a link here. Either one of these links will take you there. You can scan the QR code if you're into scanning QR codes and doing that. But you can go in, get the report, and see all of these insights that I've talked to today. So given that, I'd like to say thank you for your time today and listening to me talk about the threat landscape that we have, and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.